So I called this talk, Finding Yourself in a Position of Leadership During a Global Pandemic. And the reason for that is that when I interviewed 5 years ago to be Associate Dean for Learning and Teaching, nobody ever said in my interview, Karen, what will you do if there's a global pandemic? We had no plan for this until about March when we started to hear the news. I should say, as computer scientists, we did have a plan for zombie invasion, which is we've decided that Park Place, where IT is based, is like the best defendable location, so we're all going to go there in zombie invasion. But unfortunately, pandemics and zombie invasions have completely different ways of working. So the way that I've really coped with finding myself in this position of leadership is really thinking about everything I've learned throughout my life and trying to apply it. And this really comes back to my PhD. So this is my PhD supervisor, Professor Barbara Smith. And I did my PhD in an area called constraint programming, which is a branch of artificial intelligence, where what we try and do is find a relatively natural means of representing knowledge that a computer can understand and then they can then solve problems with. So an example of a constraint could be simple maths, x plus y equals 30. I'm sure you guys can all work out there's lots of x and y's that could be. It can be adjacent countries on the map cannot be coloured the same. That's an example of that there. It can also be if you're trying to do an emergency schedule for, say, a mountain rescue, that the helicopter can only carry one passenger. One of the ways that we use this sort of technology within the university is to do our timetables. And then we say the maths class must be scheduled between, say, 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. because there's other constraints that stop it being at different times. And what you learn when you are working with constraint programming is that the plan that comes out of this, when you put all these constraints together and you solve it, say your timetable, needs to be robust. It needs to work, but it also needs to have some flexibility in case there is change. Perhaps the maths lecturer gets ill. Someone else is covering the class and can't do 9 to 11. So there has to be another place you can put that lecture. So from doing my PhD, I really learned that plans need to be robust and flexible. The other bit of advice I had from one of my colleagues is Professor Anna-Lou Waller, who is the discipline lead in computing. And she always says, communication is rocket science. It is really difficult to get right. And actually, that meant that during COVID with our students, the thing I really concentrated on was communication. Very quickly, we set up a Microsoft team with lots of channels, added all of our students to it, and did things like have a how do I channel, so the students could ask questions about how do I do this online? How do I do this through this different way of learning? And I think that really helped us to have this school community of everybody communicating together. The other bit of advice, which actually I first heard, I think, from our dean, Jose Fiadiero, was you'll make mistakes. Forgive yourself for doing them, just fix them. And actually not beating yourself up when something goes wrong has been really important during this pandemic, because we have all made complete mistakes. There's no two ways about it. One of my worst mistakes is that during the exam season that we had in May, I said to the students, remember, it's open book, but you must not plagiarise. You must, because it's open book, you must quote sources. Turned out that for science and engineering students, they didn't really know what that meant. We got lots of replies straight away in Teams. One that said, you must be making this up as you go along, which showed how frustrated the students were to get this information in a way that they just didn't understand. As I said, communication is rocket science. What did we do? Well, we got a group together and we very quickly got some guidelines together that were clearer for science and engineering students, that made it clear that, for example, if you're using a standard maths equation you've used lots of times, you don't have to quote that because we know that's standard, and when you did have to quote. And those guidelines were really well received. So we made a mistake, but we fixed it in a day. And I can tell you, we did lots of that. The pictures on the slide are Jose, our dean, Ian and Rachel, our school office leads, Andy, our AD Quask, Helen, Pam, Dice, John and Diane. And these are all people who have helped me when I've made mistakes. They're the colleagues that I've relied on throughout this period. The first person I ever heard saying this was Dr. Selena Howden, and she said fairly on in the COVID pandemic, remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And that was a really important thing for me to learn at that point. Because at that point, I was basically working 90-hour weeks, not taking weekends off, not taking evenings off, just trying to get to the end of semester. And actually hearing that made me think, I can't carry on like this. I can't do this for the next 6 months, 9 months. I'm going to collapse. So it was really important to have that message from Stella. The people here, other than Stella, are our Associate Deans Learning and Teaching within the school. We have formed a really close community and helped each other through this pandemic. The other person on the slide in the bottom right is Julie Christie, who's led the Tour 2021 team and has been the person that I've Teams messaged a lot, sorry Julie, and said, Julie, can you just help with that? Do you know what the answer to this one is? And she's been a really invaluable colleague throughout this period. So thank you for all the Associate Deans, for all the schools, for helping build this community of support and supporting each other. The other thing came from a conversation from Rachel Menzies. So Rachel is a colleague in computing who's been, I think it's fair to say, a critical friend. I think she would agree with that. There's been times that she's disagreed with some of the ideas I've had, and she's told me that. And I have to say, I haven't always agreed with what Rachel said, but I've always listened. And having somebody that'll be honest with you is really important. And I remember having a conversation with her fairly early on when I said, I wish I could edit videos. And she said, you're right, you've got a degree in computing. You could learn it in a day, just take a day to do it. And I did. I went and learned Adobe Premiere Pro. And that really opened up a new world of ways of communicating. So I created a series of vlogs to let students know what life would be like on campus. So I get the train to work every day, so I filmed myself getting the train, what it was like, how to wear masks. I filmed how to get from Dundee Station to the Fulton building, and I filmed quite a lot on campus showing the signage and things that people would need to know to get here. Those videos have been viewed over 1,000 times. And actually both students and staff, because some staff were not back on campus at that point, said it was really reassuring to see what things would look like. So it was really worth learning that new skill to make those videos. The most important thing that I've learned throughout this pandemic is to work with our students. So these are our student representatives in the school for this year. They have been the most resilient, amazing community, prepared to offer us any support and help, ask any questions. Many of them gave up time during the summer to be on focus groups to see what teaching would be like this year, and also to look at things like communication for this year. How did they want that to be? They are a really resilient population. All of our students managed to graduate last year with a degree. We didn't have anybody who dropped out due to COVID. And I have to say, one of the things that's annoyed me the most during this pandemic is that the students have been criticised a lot for their behaviour. Our students have behaved so well. They are an amazing amount of people, and I am proud of every single one of them. The last bit of advice that somebody gave me came from Dame Wendy Hall, who at the time was in charge of Southampton Computing Department, back when it had a horrendous fire. The whole thing burnt down. They lost all the work that they'd done. And I said to her, how do you cope being the head of computing when everything's gone? And she said, I had a party. The next week I had a huge party because we had to celebrate that nobody was hurt and nobody lost their life. And that really made me think that during this pandemic time, we have to find the joy in life. We have to find the time for celebrations and make sure that it's just not all about the pandemic. So we made our staff and student awards for the school bigger and better than ever. We had over 200 people taking part. All the students got to vote on who was best. We had lots of staff, as you can see, dressing up to take part, even though it was all online. And we had a huge celebration that afternoon of all that we'd achieved. And I think that's really important, that we look for the joy in this difficult time. The other thing I learned, and this I suppose comes back to Stella saying this is a marathon, not a sprint, was really to make sure I have some downtime. I learned to cycle in April. I hadn't been on a bike since I was about 8 years old, but I learned to cycle. I cycled 100 miles in October. My husband decided in, I think about August, that he quite fancied purple hair. So I watched lots of YouTube videos. I learned how to balayage, and I made his hair purple one weekend. Like many people, I've not been able to see family and friends. My niece and I are particularly close. You can see in the picture at the bottom there. We've learned how to play games online. I'm now an Among Us expert. If anybody knows what Among Us is, I'm sure some of you do, because we've been playing so many games online. My husband and I also saw this couples challenge where you build a Lego model together, but only one of you can see the instructions and one of you's got all the Lego. So we did that. It's surprisingly difficult. We didn't fall out, but we were close. And I've cooked a lot because I really love cooking. So it's something I've really had time to do and used the spare time that I don't use for my commute during COVID. I've also got to thank my wonderful friends. So one of my friends, Erin, every month she's organised a PowerPoint party where we've just done like little PowerPoints on things that interest us. So this is a cool map, or I'm going to do one on jelly babies and the history of jelly babies, which I find quite interesting. So we've tried to have fun, even though it's a time of pandemic. Thank you for listening.